From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Chevron, Texaco didn't care at all about the destruction of the environment that it caused, and that is why we are now inviting the world to come to the Ecuadorian Amazon and see for themselves the destruction that Chevron, Texaco has caused.
Chevron's dirty hand. Ecuador launches a new campaign to force oil giant Chevron for dumping billions of gallons of toxic water into the Amazon rainforest. 2 years ago, an Ecuadorian court ruled Chevron should pay out $19 billion, but now an international arbitration panel at The Hague rules in Chevron's favor. We'll speak with Ecuador's Foreign Minister, Ricardo Patiño, about Chevron, oil drilling in the rainforest, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and more. Then Sephora Berman on Canadian tar sands extraction.
This is a petrostate. This is what happens because oil corrodes. It corrodes our pipelines, it threatens our communities, but it also corrodes our democracy. And when fossil fuel companies have an undue influence on our governments and policies, then this is what we see. But we're fighting back.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Conflicting reports are emerging about the bloody four-day standoff between Kenyan authorities and Islamist militants at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi. Kenyan officials claim they've taken control with all hostages freed, but the Somali militant group Al-Shabaab has claimed its fighters are holding their ground with live hostages inside the mall, which it said was littered with countless dead bodies. Witnesses say gunshots have continued to ring out. Some 68 people died in the initial assault over the weekend, which al-Shabaab said was revenge for Kenya's military intervention in Somalia. Among those killed was the great Ghanaian poet Kofi Awunor. Kenya's foreign minister said the attackers included 2 or 3 Americans and a British woman. President Obama responded to the tragedy Monday.
I want to express personally my condolences to not only President Kenyatta, who lost some family members in the attack, but to the Kenyan people. We stand with them against this terrible outrage that's occurred. We will provide them with whatever law enforcement support that is necessary, and we are confident that Kenya, which has been a pillar of stability in Eastern Africa, will rebuild.
The crisis led judges at the International Criminal Court to adjourn the war crimes trial of Kenyan Vice President William Ruto, who, along with President Uhuru Kenyatta, is facing charges for allegedly orchestrating violence in Kenya after the disputed 2007 elections. The focus on al-Shabaab comes amidst news the United States has quietly begun deporting people to Somalia for the first time in years, despite ongoing violence there. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune reports 33 Somalis have been deported since last year. A former FBI agent and contractor has agreed to plead guilty to being the source for an Associated Press report that revealed a foiled bomb plot in Yemen, led to the uncovering of a double agent, and prompted the Obama administration to secretly subpoena the phone records of AP journalists. Under the agreement, Donald Satchelbem will serve more than 3.5 years for the disclosure. Separately, he's agreed to plead guilty to child pornography charges that carry an even longer sentence. Officials seized his computer in May 2012, days after the leak, as part of the child pornography case, but federal investigators say they did not connect Satchelbem to the AP disclosures until after they secretly obtained a trove of phone logs from AP reporters in what the news agency's president termed a massive and unprecedented intrusion involving offices where more than 100 journalists worked. Satchelbem's prosecution is the 8th related to leaks under President Obama. Before his presidency, there were only 3 such cases in all U.S. history. Iran's foreign minister will meet this week with diplomats from 6 other countries, including U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, to discuss Iran's disputed nuclear program. It's expected to mark the highest-level in-person meeting between representatives of the United States and Iran since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Catherine Ashton, foreign policy chief for the European Union, announced the plan on Monday after meeting with Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif.
We talked about a number of important issues, but focused on the nuclear issue. We had a good and constructive discussion. Foreign Minister Zarif will join the E3+3 meeting later this week, which I will be chairing, in order to have a short discussion. And we have agreed that he and I will meet with our teams in Geneva in October.
The White House has said it's open to a meeting between Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and President Obama, both of whom are addressing the UN General Assembly today. An Egyptian court has banned all activities of the Muslim Brotherhood and its spin-off groups and ordered its assets to be seized. The group has 10 days to appeal the ban. It comes as part of a crackdown on supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi by the military-backed government that's seen some 1,000 people killed and 2,000 arrested, including many of the Brotherhood's leaders. The court issued the injunction after lawyers for the leftist Tagamu Party accused the Muslim Brotherhood of terrorism. The Brotherhood has been banned for most of its 85-year history. The U.S. military says it'll stop reporting the number of prisoners on hunger strike at Guantanamo Bay after its official tally has dropped to 19 prisoners. 18 of the prisoners are listed for force feeding with nasal tubes. The hunger strike against indefinite detention began in February. At its peak, the military counted 106 participants, while prisoner lawyers said the number was higher, with nearly all 166 prisoners taking part. The strike forced President Obama to publicly address his failure to deliver on a promise to close Guantanamo. Last month, 2 prisoners were moved to Algeria in the first transfer out of Guantanamo in nearly a year. Chiquita Company is asking a federal appeals court to dismiss lawsuits brought against it by thousands of Colombians who hold the company responsible for the murders of their loved ones at the hands of paramilitaries. Chiquita pleaded guilty in 2007 to giving funds to the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, known as the AUC, a right-wing paramilitary alliance supported by top leaders and blamed for killing tens of thousands of people, most of them civilian, beginning in the late 90s. Chiquita is seeking protection from the lawsuits, in part citing last year's Supreme Court decision limiting the ability of people outside the U.S. to sue corporations for human rights abuses in U.S. courts. U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder is the former general counsel of Chiquita. Prior to joining the Obama administration, he represented the company in lawsuits related to Chiquita's dealings in Colombia. A member of the Russian feminist punk group Pussy Riot has launched a hunger strike to protest harsh conditions in a Moldovan penal colony where she's serving a 2-year sentence for protesting Russian leader Vladimir Putin inside a Moscow cathedral. In an open letter, Nadya Tolokonnikova describes, quote, slavery-like conditions, including beatings carried out with the approval of prison officials and sewing work shifts that last 17 hours. Nadya's husband, Peter Vasilov, said she has also faced death threats.
Before the situation folded in the last several weeks, Nadia tried to change the situation internally from inside the prison. But obviously she understood that this was impossible, and in the end of her efforts, they just led to a murder threat from the prison administration.
Nadya is one of 2 members of Pussy Riot, now in penal colonies for the group's punk prayer protest in 2011, when they danced and exhorted the Virgin Mary to get Putin out. The second member, Maria Algachina, staged an 11-day hunger strike earlier this year. In Germany, Angela Merkel is moving to form a new coalition government after winning a 3rd term as chancellor. Merkel has been criticized for pushing harsh austerity policies that have sparked mass protests in countries across Europe, including Greece, Spain, and Ireland. In the U.S., the Internal Revenue Service official who became the focus of a scandal over the targeting of political groups has resigned. Lois Lerner was reportedly set to be ousted by an internal review board. She came under fire from Republicans earlier this year for heading a division that gave extra scrutiny to political groups, particularly those tied to right-wing causes. The family of a 28-year-old African college student shot dead by New York City police last year has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit seeking changes in how police respond to people with mental health issues. According to the lawsuit, Mohammed Ba was shot at least 8 times in his own home in Harlem after his mother called 911 seeking an ambulance to bring her son to the hospital because he seemed depressed. While Ba insisted he was fine and asked police to leave, they allegedly yelled at him over a period of hours, taunted him, kicked his door, and eventually forced the door open, tasered Ba, fired a beanbag, and then fatally shot him. Ba's mother says police ignored her repeated pleas to speak with her son. Police later accused Ba of stabbing 2 officers. The lawsuit seeks a shift in NYPD policies after a, quote, long series of wrongful death incidents involving people with emotional disturbances. The suit was filed by the same lawyers who represent the family of Kenneth Chamberlain, a 68-year-old Marine veteran who was shot dead in his own home by White Plains police in 2011 after accidentally activating his medical alert pendant. You can go to our website, democracynow.org, to see our extensive coverage of the Chamberlain case. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. World leaders, including President Obama, are gathering this week here in New York for the United Nations General Assembly. On Monday, I had a chance to sit down with Ecuador's Foreign Minister, Ricardo Patiño, at the United Nations. Ecuador has been at the center of several major international stories in recent years. In 2012, Ecuador granted WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange asylum. He has spent more than a year in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Over the summer, Ecuador played a role in the drama surrounding National Security Agency leaker Edward Snowden and his attempt to secure political asylum. Ecuador is also at the center of a closely watched environmental legal battle. Between 1964 and 1990, Texaco drilled for oil in the Ecuadorian Amazon and dumped as much as 18.5 billion gallons of highly toxic waste sludge into the rainforest. The waste contaminated the streams and rivers used by local people for drinking, bathing, and fishing. For the past 2 decades, there's been a legal battle over the cleanup. In 2011, an Ecuadorian court ordered the oil giant Chevron, which acquired Texaco in 2011, to pay $19 billion to indigenous and rural Ecuadorians. But Chevron's refused to pay. Last week, Chevron was dealt a partial victory when an international arbitration panel based at The Hague delivered an interim ruling questioning the validity of the 2011 verdict. The arbitration panel claimed the lawsuit against Chevron lacked a legitimate legal foundation because Ecuador had released Texaco, they said, of all potential liability back in the 90s. Ecuador has rejected the findings of The Hague's Permanent Court of Arbitration, saying indigenous plaintiffs should not be precluded from suing Chevron. Yesterday, I sat down with Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño at the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations. I began by asking him to explain this latest twist in the Chevron saga.
This tribunal has issued some decisions. One of the decisions is that Ecuador, of course, never sued Texaco, and we can't. But Chevron, Texaco could be sued by individuals for the impacts on those individuals and not for impacts on collectives. So that's something that has to be looked at further. But the government of Ecuador considers that the Court of Arbitration lacks jurisdiction and that this bilateral investment treatment is not applicable retroactively. So, just to conclude the issue of Chevron Texaco, it's important to note that the Chevron has spent millions of dollars on a campaign to discredit the Ecuadorian government, arguing that there were problems with the legal process. If that's the case, then they need to address those as such in the Ecuadorian legal system. But one of the things that they argue is that they cleaned up after devastating the Amazon, and that they didn't leave anything amiss.
Tuviera nuestro país son daños que
Chevron
se produjeron por parte de las petroleras,
any damages that is
por parte de la petrolera estatal ecuatoriana.
Still visible wasn't their fault and corresponds to the Ecuadorian government to address. President Rafael Correa,
en donde solo
a few days ago,
hizo gestión petrolera.
Went to an area where Chevron Texaco was operating, and the president put his hands in the toxic waste pits that Chevron Texaco left, and raised his oil-stained hand up to show the world how Chevron Texaco has destroyed the Ecuadorian Amazon, and did not use the cleanup methodologies that were available at the time to mitigate or even avoid environmental damages. So Chevron Texaco didn't care at all about the destruction of the environment that it caused, and that is why we are now inviting the world to come to the Ecuadorian Amazon and see for themselves the destruction that Chevron Texaco has caused, and even though Texaco left the country in 1992, these damages are still very much evident. And we have no interest in taking legal action in this regard. We simply want to show the world that they're lying.
Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño. After break, we talk about Ecuador's new plan to drill for oil in the Yasuni National Park in the Amazon rainforest. What Ecuador would think, what the president would think of a public referendum. We also talk about Edward Snowden, Julian Assange's asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and more. Stay with us. Adando y voy, where do I go? Can, a pop music group from Ecuador. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with Ecuador's Foreign Minister, Ricardo Patiño. I interviewed him Monday at the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations. We discussed the United Nations General Assembly meeting and why Ecuadorian President Correa isn't attending, as well as the plight of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who spent more than 450 days in the Ecuadorian Ecuadorian embassy in London. We also talked about the health of Cuba's revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, and the legacy of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. But first, I asked the foreign minister why Ecuador recently dropped a plan to preserve large areas of the Amazon rainforest from oil drilling by having wealthy countries pay them not to drill. President Correa said the plan to save parts of the Yasuni National Park had not attracted sufficient funding. UNESCO has designated the park as a World Biosphere Reserve because it contains 100,000 species of animals, many which are not found anywhere else in the world. Well, environmentalists Vandana Shiva, Naomi Klein, the scientist James Hansen, and others recently wrote an open letter to President Correa asking him to not forsake the initiative. The letter read in part, quote, "Along with thousands of other world citizens, we look to the Yasuni ITT initiative as a pioneering step in the international struggle for a post-fossil fuel civilization. We have been inspired by the determination of the Ecuadorian public to rejuvenate the initiative following your government's recent decision to abandon it. Accordingly, we're extremely concerned at reports that your government is attempting to repress the voices of the majority of Ecuadorians who continue to support the Yasuni proposal. We understand that efforts are underway to block a public referendum on the question, that press freedom is being curtailed, and that students exercising their right of dissent are being threatened with expulsion from their schools." That's what the letter to President Correa read. I asked Ecuador's Foreign Minister, Ricardo Patiño, to respond to the letter.
First of all, it's important to say that it was the Ecuadorian government that presented the initiative, and we've been working on it for 6 years. What does the initiative say, basically? It says, well, we'd like to preserve the extraordinary biodiversity on the surface of Yasuni, and that we want to exploit the oil in the subsurface, that is to say, underground. And that we also want to avoid drilling and selling and burning this oil, and thus avoid polluting the atmosphere. The initiative said the following: the Ecuadorian government is willing to sacrifice 50% of the resources that this oil could generate for Ecuador, resources that we need. Ecuador is not a rich country, and Ecuador needs resources for its development. There is still quite a lot of poverty. A lot has changed in the last 6 years. A lot has been improved, but we need to work quickly to achieve even better conditions, and we need these resources. All over the world, natural resources are being exploited without a great deal of concern about the impacts of that exploitation. And we appealed to the world, and we said we're willing to sacrifice 50% of the income that could potentially be generated, but the world has to contribute. And we said if the international community would cover the other 50%, we were willing to completely preserve the area of Yasuni ITT and not exploit the oil indefinitely. But the world's response was negative. We only got very few million of dollars, and we said if the world doesn't respond to our appeal, we are going to have to exploit this oil because we need these resources and the resulting income. after having done
la espera para obtener los resultados,
appealed and appealed and not seeing an echo to our appeal, Ecuador decided to exploit the oil without affecting the surface of Yasuni. This is very important. It'll have some impact, but it'll be minimal. We respect the criteria that were expressed in that open letter. If the people who signed it could raise the awareness of the world to achieve the ends that we didn't manage to achieve, we would be delighted. But unfortunately, we didn't achieve what we had proposed, and maybe there are other issues that the world is more concerned about or interested in. The world
un trillón de dólares en español
spends
en armas, en guerras.
$2 billion in arms and weapons.
Y en esto que es preservar la naturaleza,
or $2 trillion.
Los grandes países, los grandes potencias,
and
las grandes empresas no quisieron comprometerse.
The rich countries and companies did not want to contribute to the fund for Yasuni.
En países europeos muy
even in very rich, wealthy, and powerful European countries, it was the local authorities that contributed to the fund, but not the federal governments. The world has other priorities, but we also need to try and eliminate the misery that people are suffering in Ecuador. There are a lot of people who still die from intestinal illness and lack of drinking water, and so we need these resources.
What about the call for a public referendum in Ecuador on Yasuni?
The government of Ecuador can make a decision through its legislative body. And that's why the President has sent this proposal to the National Assembly to analyze it and make a decision on it. If a significant part of the population wants to organize a public referendum, they can do so, and they can collect signatures to that effect, and then we can go and have a public referendum. We don't have any problem in doing that.
Why is President Correa not addressing the UN General Assembly like so many world leaders are?
President Correa doesn't have a lot of expectations about what is said in the meetings of the General Assembly. He attended one General Assembly and addressed the hall, but there were no world leaders in the room at the time to hear what he had to say. It seems like only the first speeches are given importance, and the rest. So there's concern about the methodology of how things are organized here. And since he had the experience that he had here in the UN, he was, quite frankly, just frustrated, and he's not really interested in participating in an event where nobody really seems to be interested in hearing each other.
Foreign Minister, what about Edward Snowden and what you have learned from the leaks of this NSA contractor, the expose after expose of surveillance inside the United States and outside?
Edward Snowden le abrió los ojos al mundo.
Edward Snowden opened the eyes of the world
respecto a un delito internacional.
To an international crime.
El haber espiado a todos los países del mundo por parte de la oficina de inteligencia, la NSA en Estados Unidos.
NSA spying on the whole world.
Significa haber violado las leyes internacionales.
And that's a violation of international law.
Y además de eso, haber violado la
and
confianza
furthermore, it doesn't just violate international law, it violates international trust.
Ya no solamente en lo que Estados Unidos llama sus amigos y sus enemigos.
Not just of one's friends and enemies, as
ya
you
de por
say.
sí es grave, porque en el mundo
And
no
that
hay
in and of
amigos y
itself
enemigos.
is grave. In the world, there are not countries that are friends and countries that are enemies. We all deserve respect.
En ese mismo lenguaje del gobierno norteamericano.
And shouldn't be categorized as such. But in the rhetoric of the U.S. government, not even the U.S. government's so-called friends were respected. They wanted to know absolutely everything that was going on.
De tal manera que la denuncia que presentó
Snowden, what Snowden denounced is very useful.
Las cosas que estaban
and allows us to correct what's been going on, and the UN should take that up. Unfortunately, sometimes the power relations are such that these issues are not addressed. For example, it's not on the agenda of the UN General Assembly. And that's unfortunate.
President Rousseff of Brazil has canceled her state visit to Washington because of the information that has come out based on the leaks that she was being spied on, that the Ecuadorian energy company, Petrobras, was being spied on. Do you think you hear at the mission, at the embassy in Washington, that Ecuador is being spied on?
No se lo puedo decir.
Well, I couldn't tell you.
Pero cuando yo fui a visitar hace unas pocas semanas.
But when I was visiting Julian Assange a few weeks ago,
Julian Assange in London.
Julian Assange
in your embassy.
In London,
unos días
in the
antes
Ecuadorian embassy, they found a few days before my visit a hidden microphone in the office of our ambassador.
Todavía no podemos confirmar quién lo puso.
And we still haven't been able to ascertain who planted it, but we can imagine who it might have put it there. The information that Snowden provided indicates that everybody is spied on. And so one should probably assume that we've been spied on as well.
Venezuela has offered Edward Snowden political asylum. Is Ecuador weighing this? Like you have Julian Assange.
Nosotros somos un país muy
soberano. We are a very sovereign country with very firm positions.
Y Julian Assange está siendo
and Julian Assange is protected by asylum that Ecuador has provided him with.
Cuando el caso de Edward Snowden salió a la luz,
when the case of Edward Snowden arose, Ecuador was the first country that offered to analyze his asylum request, while many countries immediately rejected the request.
Ecuador consideró que era conveniente no presentarse solo en
considered that it was best not to be alone in this fight because it's a very difficult, sticky matter given the political landscape of the world.
Y no podemos,
and we can't
desatenderla.
ignore that fact. That's why we spoke with the ALBA countries and we addressed the issue of Snowden, and we told them that we thought that it was important that other countries also offer a possible asylum to him. And because of that, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia offered asylum to him directly, and we thought that was good because Ecuador can carry the weight of all these issues as if we were a very powerful country. That's not the case. That's why we're pleased that these other countries have offered asylum and made that decision so that they don't gang up on us.
And Julian Assange's fate, he remains in the Ecuadorian mission in London, in the embassy in London. It's been more than a year.
Sí. Y lamentablemente el Reino Unido
yes,
todavía
and
no
unfortunately the United Kingdom still has not provided him with safe conduct.
He hablado en varias oportunidades
I've spoken a number of times with William Hague.
Y le hemos ofrecido
and we've also
la información
provided him with the legal arguments
no solo le permite, sino que le obligaría
which don't just allow the United Kingdom but actually compel and force the United Kingdom to provide safe conduct, but they continue to refuse to provide it. So the decision is in the hands of the UK.
President Correa was just visiting with Fidel Castro in Cuba, spent several hours with him. What is Fidel Castro's influence on Latin America and his significance? And also, if you could end finally by talking about the legacy of former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez.
Fidel Castro es una figura.
Fidel Castro is an international figure.
Es un hombre que
he's a man who
también liberar a su país de la dictadura de Batista.
Managed to liberate his country from the Batista dictatorship.
E inició la construcción de una sociedad en beneficio de
and laid the foundation for a society that is beneficial for all of the Cubans. Unfortunately, the reaction of the United States government was to attack Cuba and to impose a criminal embargo. But the Cuban government,
a pesar de esos problemas,
despite these problems, has managed to defend the life and well-being and health of its people. And not only, it has also offered international cooperation. Despite its economic limitations, it's offered international cooperation with other countries. They offered it to Ecuador, in fact. I say it with a certain amount of concern. We would have loved that Europe and the United States offer the thousands of scholarships that Cuba has offered to Ecuadorian students to study medicine. There are 2,000 Ecuadorian students who are studying medicine in Cuba. Other countries only want to train our military personnel. That's quite a contrast. So that's just a way to begin to respond to your question. What is the influence of Fidel Castro? I think it's a moral influence. I participated in the conversations that President Correa has had with Fidel Castro. In fact, I was present at the last conversation. And Fidel Castro never offered advice to us.
Conversamos de los temas mundiales.
We talk about the state of the world and
conversamos de cómo lograr un mejor
how to achieve
de cómo trabajar en los temas de salud,
better development, how to improve health care and protection of our natural resources. That's what we talk about.
How is Fidel Castro's health?
Él está un poco con dificultades para la movilidad.
A bit challenged in terms of mobility.
Pero en términos
but in terms of lucidity and reasoning and his concern for world issues, it's quite extraordinary what one learns from him. He has an incredible memory and a capacity to analyze current events and to foresee what's going to happen. He's already 30 or 50 years ahead of the curve, but his mobility is a bit problematic.
And the legacy of Chavez.
The
legacy of Hugo Chavez is extraordinary.
Después de la Revolución Cubana,
after the Cuban Revolution,
es justamente en 1998.
It's in 1998 when Hugo Chavez took office.
Estaba absolutamente solo en América Latina.
And he was totally alone in Latin America.
De derecha y neoliberal.
There were a lot of right-wing and neoliberal governments.
Se batió solito
and he would take a really strong stance in international events, and it was really hard because he was isolated. Imagine how difficult it is to be the lone voice and have everybody against you, but little by little other progressive governments came to power, and now there's many progressive governments: Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, Bolivia, Nicaragua, many other progressive governments in the Caribbean as well that have changed the face of Latin America. But the strength and power of the discourse and the proposals of Hugo Chavez to create the integration of Latin America is legendary. Also, he contributed to strengthening a Latin American and Caribbean consciousness about the need for greater unity. And so that's why we always speak of Hugo Chavez with a lot of respect and endearment, because he stood with Ecuador when times were tough. Like he did with other countries, he supported our process and contributed to the dream of Simón Bolívar and contributed to making that dream a reality.
Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patiño. I interviewed him on Monday at the permanent mission of Ecuador to the United Nations. President Correa has decided not to address the UN General Assembly this year. You can visit our website at democracynow.org to watch more of our interview as the foreign minister talks about the crisis in Syria, Ecuador's controversial new media law, and Patiño's time working with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we head north to talk about the Keystone XL. Not here in the United States, but in Canada. Stay with us.
All about the bling, 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 wanna pump the toss and
That's Wanna Pump the Tar Sands protest song against the Royal Bank of Scotland. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 5 years ago this month, the firm TransCanada submitted a permit request to build the Keystone XL oil pipeline, which would bring tar sands oil from Canada to refineries on the Gulf Coast. The project has sparked one of the most contentious environmental battles in decades. The Obama administration initially appeared ready to approve Keystone XL, but an unprecedented wave of activism from environmentalists and residents of the states along its path has forced several delays. In the summer of 2011, 1,200 people were arrested outside the White House. Well, on Saturday, protests were held once again around the country in a national day of action urging President Obama to reject Keystone's construction. President Obama also faces continued pressure from backers of the Keystone XL. In their latest push for the project, House Republicans have announced plans to tie the pipeline's construction to the upcoming vote on raising the nation's debt ceiling. Well, on Monday, delegates at the 2013 International Women's Earth and Climate Summit that was held in Suffern, New York, called on Obama to reject the Keystone, saying, quote, "There is no single project in North America that's more significant than Keystone XL in terms of the carbon emissions it would unleash. As women who are already seeing the tragic impacts of climate change on families, on indigenous peoples, and on entire countries, we urge you to choose a better future by rejecting Keystone XL tar sands pipeline." At the conference, Melina Lubacan Massimo, a member of the Lubacan Cree First Nation, described the impact that massive oil and gas extraction has had on her family and its traditional land in northern Alberta.
I come from a small northern community. It's Cree, Nihiao is in our language what we call it. There's nothing that compares with the destruction going on there. If there were a global prize for unsustainable development, the tar sands would be a clear winner. Not that there's a competition going on by any means, but that I just think that, world-renowned people, experts, are really seeing this as one of the, major issues, and that's why it's one of the biggest, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and why Canada pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol. So this is what it looks like, very viscous. It's, not fluid, so it takes a lot more energy, a lot more water, produces a lot more byproduct. So it's equaling to why it's such a big area is 141,000 square kilometers, equal to that of destroying, England and Wales combined, or the state of Florida for American folks. The mines that we're dealing with are bigger than entire cities. So there's about 6, 7 right now, be up to 9. And this is Imperial Oil, say, for example, will be bigger than Washington, D.C. alone. So that's just a mine. And this is taken from the air. So these are some of the biggest dump trucks in the world. And a lot of the issues for toxicity that we're dealing with is, and which relates to the water, is these huge tailing ponds. They're called ponds, but they're actually big toxic sludge lakes. They currently span 180 square kilometers just of toxic sludge that's sitting on the landscape. So every day, 1 million liters are leaching into the Athabasca watershed, which is, where our families drink from. I'm from the Peace region, but it connects to the Athabasca, and it goes up into the Arctic basin, so that's where all the northern folks will be getting some of, these toxins, and these contain cyanide, mercury, lead, polyaromatic hydrocarbon, nymphatic acids, so there's a lot of issues that we're dealing with health-wise.
That was Melina Lubacan Massimo, member of the Lubacan Cree First Nation in northern Alberta. All of this comes as Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper recently sent President Obama a letter offering a greater pledge of reduced carbon emissions if the Keystone pipeline is built to bring tar sands oil from Canada to the United States. Well, for more, I'm joined by one of Canada's leading environmental activists, Zipporah Berman. She's campaigned for decades around clean energy and is the former co-director of Greenpeace International's Climate Unit. She's now focused on stopping tar sands extraction as a member of the steering committee for the Tar Sands Solutions Network. Zipporah Berman is also the co-founder of Forest Ethics and the author of the book, This Crazy Time, Living Our Environmental Challenge. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Zipporah.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Explain what tar sands means for you in Canada and how it has affected your whole country.
The tar sands are the single largest industrial project on Earth. The scale is almost incomprehensible if you've never been there. They are not only the single reason that Canada's climate pollution is going up, that we will not meet any of the targets, even the weak targets that have been set. But they're also the most toxic project in the country. They're polluting our water and our air. The tar sands produces 300 million liters of toxic sludge a day that is just pumped into open pit lakes that now stretch about 170 kilometers across Canada. And, you know, one of the important things about what's happening in Canada right now is that Canadian policy on climate change, on environment, on many issues is being held hostage to the goal that this federal government, the Harper government, and the oil industry have of expanding the tar sands no matter what the cost. You know, oil corrodes. It's corroding our pipelines and leading to spills and leaks that are threatening our communities, but it's also corroding our democracy. What we're seeing in Canada is literally the elimination of 40 years of environmental laws in the last 2 years in order to make way for quick expansion of tar sands and pipelines. I mean, the Keystone is not the only pipeline this industry is proposing. It's a spider web of pipelines across North America so that they can try and expand this dirty oil as quickly as possible.
And why is it so dirty?
It's really dirty because the oil is mixed with sand. So in order to get that oil out, they have to use natural gas. More natural gas is used in the tar sands than all the homes in Canada. So they use natural gas and fresh water to actually remove the oil from the sand. And the result is that each barrel of oil from the tar sands has 3 to 4 times more emissions, more climate pollution than conventional oil.
And explain how this pipeline would traverse Canada and the United States and where it goes, what it's for. Does the U.S. benefit from the oil going through the pipeline?
No, this is an export pipeline. What the industry wants is they want to get this oil off the continent because they'll get a better price. And so all of the pipelines that are currently being proposed are in order so that the industry can export the oil. So the Keystone, for example, will go all the way from Alberta straight down through the United States and out to the Gulf. And it's not for U.S. consumption. The majority of that oil is destined to, you know, the U.S. is really just in the Canadian oil industry's way. And the result is that this is a pipeline that presents enormous risk to the American people as a result of the terrible record of oil spills and leaks, and not a lot of benefit.
Sephora, you've been meeting with a number of scientists this weekend. The New York Times had an interesting editorial called Silencing Scientists, and it said over the last few years, the government of Canada, led by Stephen Harper, has made it harder and harder for publicly financed scientists to communicate with the public and with other scientists. What's going on?
Well, first of all, the government has shut down the majority of scientific research in the country that had to deal with climate change. This is a government in denial, and they do not want to talk about climate change. So last year they shut down the Atmospheric Research Station, which was one of the most important places in the world to get climate data. They shut down the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. They've fired hundreds of scientists, and the ones that are left are being told that they can't release their research to us, even though it's taxpayers-funded research. They're also being told that they can't speak to the press unless they have a handler, and it's an approved interview. They have to have a handler from the Prime Minister's office. So the scientists that I've talked to they're embarrassed, they're frustrated, they're protesting. Last week in Canada, we had hundreds of scientists hit the streets in their lab coats, protesting the federal government because they can't speak. They're being muzzled. You know, to the extent that the, quite eminent journal Nature last year published an editorial saying it's time for Canada to set its scientists free.
I mean, this is an amazing story. We know it in the United States under the Bush administration. You had James Hansen, who was head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA, who had a handler who hadn't graduated from college. He was, I think his credential was that he had been active on the Bush campaign committee, re-election campaign committee. And James Hansen had to go through him to deal with the media.
Right. Well, and James Hansen still got to deal with, to speak to the media. Most of the scientists that I'm talking to in Canada can't speak to the media at all. And if they want to talk about climate change, they're definitely not going to get those interviews approved. But it's not just the scientists that are being muzzled and the climate research that's being shut down and people that are being fired. We've also seen an unprecedented attack on charitable organizations that deal with environmental research. The Canadian government has the majority of environmental organizations under Canadian revenue audit. And so the result is you have the majority of the country's environmental leaders not able to be a watchdog on what the government is doing. And secret documents revealed through Freedom of Information this year show that the government eliminated all these environmental laws in Canada at the request of the oil industry because the environmental laws were in their way. The Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline crosses 1,000 streams. And that would normally trigger an environmental assessment process. Well, when you have no laws, you have no environmental assessment. So when they eradicated all the environmental laws, 3,000 environmental assessments for major industrial projects in Canada were cancelled. Now those projects are just approved without environmental assessment.
What does it mean, the activism for you in Canada in the United States, when clearly President Obama has been forced to delay the decision on the Keystone XL because of the massive protest against it?
I think that what we're seeing, not only in the United States but also in Canada, is an unprecedented climate movement. I think that these pipelines have provided a tangible focus for communities on the ground, and the oil industry and the government have, in a sense, created their own perfect storm. Because while before it might have been people who were concerned about climate change that would get involved in tar sands or pipeline issues, now it's people worried about their groundwater. It's First Nations and Indigenous people across North America who are protesting their rights. It's landowners. And so now you have this perfect storm.
Earlier this month, the legendary Canadian musician Neil Young spoke out against the extraction of tar sands oil in Canada and its export to the U.S. through the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. He was speaking to a National Farmers Union rally in Washington, D.C. Neil Young described his recent visit to a tar sands community in Alberta, Canada.
The fact is, Fort McMurray looks like Hiroshima. Fort McMurray is a wasteland. The Indians up there and the native peoples are dying. The fuels all over, the fumes everywhere. You can smell it when you get to town. The closest place to Fort McMurray that is doing the tar sands work is 25 or 30 miles out of town, and you can taste it when you get to Fort McMurray. People are sick. People are dying of cancer because of this.
That's the legendary musician Neil Young. I don't know how many people here in the U.S. know that he is Canadian, but he is. The significance of him coming in. Also, what did the climatologist, the scientist James Hansen, call the tar sands?
Dr. Hansen has referred to the Keystone XL pipeline as the fuse to the largest carbon bomb on the planet. And he says that his studies are showing that if we allow the tar sands to expand at the rates that the government and industry want it to expand, then it's game over for the planet.
Zipporah Berman, I saw you at the International Women's Earth and Climate Summit in Suffern, and you talked about your son having to respond to a question of his. We only have a minute, but explain.
One night at dinner, my son, who was 8 at the time, turned to me and said, "Mommy, why does the government think you're a terrorist?" Which is not really the conversation you want to have with your son. Because he had heard on the radio that on the Senate floor, the Harper government was proposing that we change the definition of the term domestic terrorism in Canada to include environmentalism.
And so what does that mean for you, and what does that mean for environmental activists? Where are you headed now? What are you going to do around tar sands?
Canadians who care about these issues are under attack by our own government, and we're being told that that what we do is not in the national interest unless we support the oil industry's agenda. But I think this government has overreached, and we are now finding, our phones are ringing off the hook. People are joining the campaign and stepping up. And let's be clear, Canadians want clean energy. Canadians, many of them, are very embarrassed about what our government is doing internationally. So our movement is growing, and so far we have slowed down all of these pipelines and the expansion.
What's the alternative?
Well, the alternative for Canada is not only clean energy, renewable energy, which now we can build at scale, we know that, but it's also supporting other aspects of our economy. Because when you support only one aspect of your economy, the most capital-intensive sector in the country, then it starts to destroy your manufacturing base, your service industry, your tourism industry. We need a diversified economy in Canada, and that's entirely possible.
Zipporah Berman, I want to thank you for being with us. Leading environmental activist in Canada. She's campaigned for decades around clean energy, former co-director of Greenpeace International's Climate Union, now focused on stopping tar sands extraction. That does it for our show. We have 2 job openings at Democracy Now!, a Linux systems administrator and annual giving manager.